Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. Joining me on today's episode is Brandon Weichert. He is a geopolitical analyst. He is the author of 4 best-selling books, including one that I think is going to cover a lot of what we're discussing today, How the West Lost Ukraine, a Disaster of Our Own Making. He's a former congressional staffer. And also, he is the senior national security editor at the National Interest and contributor at Popular Mechanics. So, Brandon, thank you so much for joining me today. How you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. And I should add, just a few weeks ago, I became the host of the National Security Hour every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. on iHeartRadio.
Wow.
We talk about all kinds of stuff like I think we're going to be talking about today. So.
I'm surprised iHeartRadio. I mean, not to.
Yeah, well, it's a syndicated. It's through AmericaOutloud.news, and we syndicate through iHeart every Wednesday night.
Yeah, no hate on iHeartRadio, but just anything that comes to the mainstream, I'm surprised to hear that a voice who's telling the truth on Russia and Ukraine would be allowed on. So that's very good news.
Well, there has been a real push, at least on the right in America, to really respect free speech, so much so that we get shot if we respect free speech too much. But that, luckily, so far it's been okay. Everything's good. No one's told me what to say.
Rest in peace, Charlie Kirk.
That's right.
I saw some of your tweets. I think you, like me, and Candace Owens, just, she was a very close friend of Charlie, and there's a lot of inconsistencies there, but I hope that we can get to the bottom of this. I hope they don't sweep things under the rug.
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind, I'm a father of 3 young children around his kids' age, is those kids are not going to see their dad. And I think that's the part that everybody needs to keep in mind, is the family. So, our prayers are with him.
Same with me. Well, to get started in this conversation, another, conflict that has, brought the loss of life of so many people, well over 1 million now, probably. The Russia-Ukraine conflict. I want to start by asking you your thoughts. President Trump commented on this today on the at least 19, if I understand correct, Russian drones that entered Polish airspace. They were shot down. Now you have the Coalition of the Willing, who's trying to justify some conflict against Russia yet again over these drones. What do you make of all of this?
Well, first of all, I think terms like Coalition of the Willing and Axis of Evil should be permanently retired, given the implications of. They're using it unironically, and I'm like, I remember the Iraq War vividly. I don't think we want to be replicating that. So on that front, just the word usage is very creepy. And it shows that the same people, by the way, many of the same people, and I talk about this in my book, who got us into Iraq are many of the same people who got us into this mess in Ukraine. And on some level, the reason they're using these terms is because they're really not that apologetic about the Iraq War. They don't actually have a problem with the Iraq War. And so they're just replicating their mistakes now on a grander scale. So where I think this is going, I think that, and I just had an article published about an hour ago at the National Interest. It looks like there were 19 drones. The drones they were using, I think, is called the Garasov, or I can't remember the name. It starts with a G. But basically, I looked into these drones, and these drones are very rudimentary, and they are used for reconnaissance usually. They had no warheads on these. There was no weapons on these drones, these 19 drones. And what I have found is that those drones, because they're very cheap and mass produced, they have a very rudimentary GPS or navigation system. Sometimes they go off course. And so it is very possible, and I think it's probably likely, and I said this in my piece, that those 19 drones were probably intended for somewhere in Ukraine, and they just went off course. Why? I mean, it could be a glitch, or maybe somebody was messing with the electronic systems on board. But we don't know what the actual intentions were. The Kremlin denies that this was any attempted attack on Poland. And I really don't understand what the motivation would have been for Russia to send 19 drones into very well-defended Polish airspace. And even if it was a provocation, look, NATO responded. They intercepted the drones almost immediately, F-35s and F-16s from Poland, and I think Dutch F-16s or F-35s went in and took those systems out. No muss, no fuss. I don't really know what the big, hoopla is, especially when we consider if you keep going down this path of trying to balloon this up, the eventual result will be World War III. And I don't think either the United States or Russia, certainly not Ukraine, benefit from turning this incident into the casus belli for the war that we all know NATO is just jonesing for right now.
That seems like a very interesting point. If they're trying to use this to justify World War III, that the drones, I didn't even know that the drones supposedly were not armed. They're just
That's what I heard. And even if they were, the onboard systems are the navigation system is rudimentary. So these things go off course. It's just because they're cheap, they're mass produced. You just kind of churn them out like sausages. So, I mean, again, I don't know for sure, but why assume this was it's a weird attack, if you ask me. It's a very small, what's Russia? If Russia really wanted to go after NATO, I would think they would be using a much larger array of weapons, and it would be much more devastating than it was. I mean, this was, so.
Moving on to some of the other comments Trump made on, I believe it was Fox and Friends this morning. He said that his patience is increasingly running out with President Putin.
Yeah.
He also mentioned that, we're considering secondary sanctions on Russia, oil banks. He also mentioned the tariffs, 50% tariffs on India over their refusal to ditch Russian oil. I'll ask you a first question about that. Do you think any of these measures are going to be successful in bringing into the conflict?
No. Look, sanctions in a limited kind of fashion, yes, they can work. If they're limited and very tailored to a very carefully crafted strategy, they can work. But more often than not, the way American powers, the American and their allies do their sanctions is just sort of amorphous, ambiguous. We just slap them across the board. And that might work on a small country like Iraq, under Saddam Hussein. We sanctioned the heck out of them. That might work on some of these smaller countries. But you're talking about a country like Russia, crosses 11 time zones. It is a commodity superpower. I keep telling my colleagues in DC, one of the other jobs I have is I'm an occasional consultant for the Air Force here. I fly up to DC and these bases all the time. And I tell them this all the time. Everybody forgets that Russia is a commodity superpower. They can basically become self-sufficient if they are really made to become that way. And they have been made that way by the sanctions. So if anything, in my opinion, any future sanctions that we impose on Russia directly or on their trading partners indirectly will have greater negative consequences for the United States than for Russia. I mean, just look at India. The United States needs India to contain China. That is a key strategic impetus. This is always what we were talking about in the Trump first term. How do we use India to help us? And now suddenly that is all gone. Peter Navarro and Trump in about 2 minutes have destroyed 10 years worth of working relations with the Indians. And now India's running closer to Russia and China because of not only the sanctions threats, but the tariff threats as well. So I don't think any of these threats are going to ultimately help the Americans at the strategic level.
Were you surprised by that, to see that India had such resilience against these threats and the tariffs?
Not really, because India, like Russia, is a large country now I think India has a much larger GDP than Russia, but still they have a large GDP. They have certain advantages that will make them a little bit harder to contain from the sanction angle. Plus, you can't blame Narendra Modi for wanting to get his people, which is this large growing population with a lot of need for energy. He's trying to get them cheap, reliable access to energy. Why are we getting angry about that? This is something that India needs to be a competitive economy and to be an actual useful ally for the United States in containing China. So no, this doesn't, that doesn't surprise me that India is able to do this. And another thing I keep reminding my friends at the Pentagon that they seem to all forget, traditionally, India has always been very close with Russia. This goes back to their independence. They don't want to be reliant on any Western power because of their colonial experience with Britain for several hundred years. So it's going to be very hard to break them of their dependence on Russia's military and energy sources. they were starting to pivot a little bit, actually, the last few years in terms of looking at buying the F-35 and starting to diversify their military portfolio. But now I think all that's done because of how badly the Trump administration has unfortunately handled this specific issue. And it all goes back to Ukraine, Jackson. And the key thing here is, if you want better relations with India, if you want better relations with Russia, if you want to contain China, if you want to end the North Korea fight, if you want to end the issues in the Middle East, Russia is the linchpin to that. And you can't get Russia on side if this Ukraine war, we're still funding and fueling it. We've got to stop this war to get better relations with Russia, which will in turn, I think, unlock all the other resolutions to our other problems.
Going back to Trump's statements, he said he's, growing impatient or whatever. What do you think it is that is the holdup here? I mean, you had Trump, who had 3 men around him leading up to his inauguration. Grinnell, that other guy who was the Ukrainian envoy.
Talking about Kellogg?
Kellogg.
Yeah.
The worst of the bunch. And then you had Vance, who they were all submitting their own proposals for how they should engage with Russia. How is it that Trump has managed to, I would at this point say, it's been a royal fuck up. I mean, there's been nothing achieved besides photo ops in Alaska. And it pains me to say that because I wanted to see peace and I supported the efforts for peace. And I was hopeful, but we've had nothing.
Yeah, I think this is an issue of the art of the deal meeting the reality of geopolitics. And ultimately, Trump comes from a very different mindset and a world professionally, whether you're looking at his real estate business background or his reality TV star background. This is a very different world he's dealing with. He's dealing with very serious people. Vladimir Putin, whether you like him or hate him, is a very serious player on the world stage. He is. And you can't go in expecting to, show an F-22 or a B-2 flyover. He doesn't care. Why would he get his guys? Listen, the Russians are taking on the entire NATO alliance right now in Ukraine, and they're winning. So why would he feel threatened by that appearance at the Alaska summit? If anything, it made us look kind of clownish, like it's sort of like an impotent threat. Like what we're going to bomb Russia? It's silly. And so I think that part of this is Trump is kind of learning on the job still. And I think that ultimately we have to remember, and I say this as somebody who has dealt with the Mar-a-Lago crew for almost 10 years now, he doesn't really have a plan. He's kind of America's id. And so it's in the moment. The last person he talked to is usually the one that has the most amount of influence on him. So he's got Susie Wiles as his chief of staff. And now she's brought a degree of discipline with her, and she's very smart, but she's very much an old school Republican, anti-Russia type individual. She came from Jeb Bush's wing of the party. And then he's also got now Marco Rubio, who I like. I knew Marco when I'm from Florida, and I liked him, but ultimately he is a neoconservative. And now he's both Secretary of State and he is now the acting national security advisor. So those are the people he's talking to most, and they're the ones directing sort of his view of things. And then Kellogg's talking to Rubio and Wiles. And so they're having a lot of input on a daily basis almost with Trump. So it's skewing, I think, his view of the situation. And he doesn't want to be seen, I think, as turning his back on NATO, but at the same time, he also doesn't like NATO, but he knows the political fallout will be great if he really fully breaks from NATO. But I think he's got to, because we can't afford this. We literally can't afford this war anymore. We're depleting our military resources right here when we need them most. And we can't replenish them as well as we used to because our defense industrial base is corrupt and broken. And so if he really is serious about the national interest, he's got to get a deal with Putin. Failing that, and I wrote this in the American Conservative back in May, I think how things are going to play out actually is Trump is going to vetch for the next several months about Putin and how intransigent the Ukrainians are and how horrible everything is. And I think at some point in the next few months, he's just going to walk away and he's going to say, I'm out, I'm done. And he'll try to spin it as a victory and he'll let the pieces fall as they may, because I think he's realizing he can't sustain this. He doesn't want to appear weak. He doesn't want to appear like he got beat, but he also can't sustain this, and he knows this. So I think at some point he's just going to walk away, and that might be the best thing here.
I think that is a victory for the United States to say we're wiping our hands clean of this business. You said U.S. can't sustain this. Europe definitely can't sustain this.
That's right.
And I guess that's my question. JD Vance came out the other day. He said this hold up. The two main points here are, he said, territorial for Russia and security for Ukraine.
Yeah.
Okay. Pray to God that Russia doesn't ask for more territory than they've already, liberated or taken.
Right.
And for Ukraine security, I mean, what can be offered to them that's not going to offend Russia? Why don't they just drop the dice where they are right now and hope that things work out for the best?
Well, and this is another essay I wrote, the last one I wrote at the American Conservative. I outlined how actually the problem is Zelensky. The problem is not Trump or Putin. It's not even really Europe to some degree. I mean, to some degree it is, but the real problem is Zelensky and his government. They do not want peace. I was just on Al Arabiya. I know you were recently. I had a very loud debate with a psychotic Ukrainian in a Jedi robe, and he was screaming at me about how we basically need to go to World War III for Ukraine. The bottom line is, you ask what more can we do? I say we've given them everything and they can't win. And that's at the very end of the day, we just have to be able to be the adult in the room and say, we've given you everything you possibly asked for. We did everything for you, short of sending Marines to do the fighting for you, which I think is what they really want. And so we're going to walk away because ultimately Putin has the tactical leverage. He has the leverage on the ground. The Russians have not lost any territory in 4 years. They've adapted to this attritional warfare style. This is the traditional Russian way of war. This is how they beat Hitler, right? This is they do attrition and encirclement of the enemy, and they just grind them out. And so the Ukrainians, there's nothing more to give them. The issue is Zelensky and the people around him, the Banderites or whatever you want to call them. They don't want to let this go because ultimately they know if America does pull out, if they do get a peace deal, the gravy train, the money stops flowing the way it used to into Ukraine. And let's face it, this is one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. They haven't had an election in over a year. Okay, Zelensky's overstayed his term in office. So clearly the Zelensky government, if you want to call it that, is the real impediment to peace. They stop the war, they lose their money, they stop the war, they're not going to have the kind of relevance they once had. And this is why I think we're not going to see a peace deal. It's going to have to be, Trump's going to have to be big man and say, I'm cutting my losses. I'm done.
When you look at the Trump administration right now, they've taken the approach with Ukraine to say, okay, we're going to slowly turn off the tap of weapons flow. It's kind of a difficult thing to do logistically to stop that machine, that train that's rolling at 1,000 miles an hour. In the next Pentagon bill, there's a proposed $600 million, if I remember correct, for Ukraine. Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to stop that. Yeah. But the two interesting things I see are for Ukraine are intelligence sharing has continued and Starlink for free has continued. On the flip side, in NATO, you have Trump that is getting all these European states to increase their spending in NATO, and Trump is happy to stay in NATO. Do you think that these things are in the interests of America right now?
No.
Putting aside all the geopolitical context, I guess, but just looking at America specifically.
Well, the only thing I would say is kind of in the interest of America is to test the Starlink capability as a backdoor to Starshield, which is SpaceX's kind of military version of Starlink they're developing. But even that now, it's been used pretty much since the start of the war to great effect. I mean, the Ukrainians have been able to kind of stay in the Russian OODA loop because of the presence of Starlink. The Russians know it. The Chinese know it. Both China and Russia are now developing very serious countermeasures to Starlink, which is going to have knock-on negative consequences for the U.S. military, because we were all banking on Starlink being the solution to our satellite vulnerabilities. So we've now kind of highlighted something that I don't think we should have highlighted in a proxy war, that now Russia and China both are figuring out ways to kind of come up with very good countermeasures to. So I think on the one hand, it's good to test that system, just looking at it objectively. On the other hand, though, we're testing it and now highlighting the vulnerabilities that, or a potential vulnerability that will be exploited. God help us if the war expands to include the United States directly. The other question you had about NATO, I think everything NATO's doing is explicitly against the interests of the American people right now. I think that NATO for these European leaders is a sop. I think it is a windfall for European elites. Europe gets a lot of money from us in the form of foreign aid and whatnot through NATO. They get a nice, big, beautiful headquarters in Brussels that employs a lot of people. And oh, by the way, all the money we send them for NATO means they haven't had to invest in their own defense, and they can build these fabulous welfare programs that end up attracting all these, illegal immigrants from North Africa and the Arab lands, which of course is another problem for them. But ultimately, if they lose NATO, just like with Zelensky, if they lose NATO, or if NATO stops being a priority for the Trump administration, they're worried that gravy train is going to stop. So there's a huge money economic factor here. They're trying to figure out, how do we keep the Americans invested even under Trump? So one of the things they do is flattery. They flatter the hell out of Trump, and he's very weak to that. And the second thing is, they're trying to say, hey, we're gonna, don't worry, we're increasing our money, and it's gonna all be sent back to the United States. We're increasing what we're paying on NATO, but really they're not increasing anything. This is all down the line, and it's meager. Like, they really, if you're in Europe and you're really afraid of Russia, you should be jacking up your defense spending to like 10 or 12%, not 3 or 5% in 10 years. You know what I mean? Like, this is all for show. It's to keep the Americans invested long enough to ensure that the Americans don't go anywhere.
And, given that what Trump is doing with NATO, I would also argue is not in the interests of the United States right now. And also, you have Trump, who, he made his call into the coalition of the willing, and he said, you do your thing with you talk about your troops, and if you want to deploy them as peacekeepers, but what you really should do is stop buying the Russian oil, Russian gas, even if it passes through India, buy ours instead.
Right.
Everything is directed at not necessarily making Europe weaker, but particularly more reliant and dependent upon the United States.
Sure.
Should that be our goal right now? I mean, it seems like we should just kill this. Not really, but you know what I mean? We should remove this regime in Brussels and rein in their power and start from scratch.
Well, ultimately, that's going to be up to the Europeans, because let's face it, whether you're talking about EU or NATO, the individual European members of those organizations have ceded far too much of their sovereignty to Brussels in both instances. So this is that part is sort of a European issue. And I think with the rise of these alternative right-wing parties, I think that's where this is headed, is eventually there's going to be a renegotiation of a generational, level happening for the first time. In terms of what America's doing, on the one hand, I go, look, that's very smart for Trump to do that. Just looking at it objectively, we want more countries to be dependent on our stuff than Russia or even another country that's, we're friends with. But at the end of the day, it's not making Europe stronger. If we're really interested in European countries being allies as opposed to vassals, this doesn't make them stronger. And I would direct everybody look at the German example. Obviously, we had a hand in blowing up that pipeline, whether directly or indirectly. That's up for more learned men who have access to this stuff to know. But we clearly, NATO, the U.S., clearly had a hand in blowing up Germany's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And it was done in part to make Germany, the most powerful European economy, consistently dependent more on Uncle Sam. The problem is, Germans' great economy since the end of the Cold War was built upon the foundation of cheap, reliable Russian natural gas. And now that option is gone to them. And look at what Germany's going through. They're going through massive recessionary woes. Their economy's contracting. They're struggling. They're basically having a kind of a silent revolution politically, because people are understandably reacting to the loss of this economic might that they once had up until 2 years ago. And that's entirely the result of NATO basically weakening Germany and trying to make them dependent on U.S. energy sources. So if you're interested in really beefing up as an ally, as a bulwark, Germany and these other European powers, making them more dependent on U.S. energy sources, which are more expensive because of the transportation costs. You're sending it over water. It's more expensive than you are from getting it next door in Russia. This is not the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. If it's not America's duty to rein in Europe, and I agree with that. I mean, it's up to the Europeans to figure out what they need. And we can't get Russia to bend the knee. The Trump administration can't do that. I don't think anyone can do that.
I don't think anybody should want to. I don't think anybody should want to either. I mean, any more than we would want them trying to make us bend the knee. I mean, this is ridiculous, you know?
If those machinations will fail, how are we going to rein in Zelensky? And this will be my final question to you, because that's the end goal here.
Well, it looks like, so in that Al Arabiya debate with the Jedi robe Ukrainian, the other guy on the panel was none other than Christopher Steele. And I said something to him very purposely, because I know what MI6 is doing right now. And I know he's still very much involved with MI6, even though he says he's not. They are propping up Zaluzhny, Valery Zaluzhny, who was the very famous wartime general that wanted to negotiate with Putin after a year or two of fighting, realizing, hey, we can't win. And it was Zelensky who pushed him out. And it looks like the British, and I think probably the Americans, are laying the groundwork to oust Zelensky and replace him with Zaluzhny, who is both seen as a more credible person with the Ukrainian public, but also who has a history of wanting to do real negotiations with the Russians. I think that's where this is shaping up to go. I don't know, though, because Steele, when I said this, you know, his response was, you can watch the clip, he kind of smiled and he said, well, he goes, it has to be done through elections. And I was like, okay, I was like, whatever, like whatever. But I think that's where the plan is, I think. And I don't know if it's going to happen overnight. And of course, this is a problem because timing is everything, right? As long as Zelensky clings to power, the war will continue going as horribly as it has. And obviously America and Britain don't want to give up on their investment. So they want to make sure that they're going to have a guy in Kyiv who they feel they can rely on. And Zaluzhny is one of those people. But at the same time, I would hope if Zaluzhny is going to be the guy, that he's serious about negotiating and we don't find ourselves right back where we are right now. He's beholden to these Banderites and beholden to the Americans and British, who have this insane fixation on breaking Russia in the field, which hasn't happened and won't happen. We're breaking ourselves. And so, but I think this is where that's going, is unless Putin takes Kyiv, which could very well happen, because look, the Ukrainians are collapsing right now, even with all the help we're giving them. But if that doesn't happen, and if the war stays in the East the way it is, the way it has, I think there will be some kind of regime change one way or another in Kyiv, where we're backing Zaluzhny and extricating Zelensky.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Brandon, thank you so much for joining me today. Where's the best place for people to follow along your work, and where can they purchase your books, especially your new one?
Well, you can find me at Brandon on Twitter, and I post there pretty regularly. You can find me at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, the National Security Hour with Brandon Weichert. It's through AmericaOutloud.news. And you can find me, my books, anywhere books are sold. Amazon's probably the best, easiest place. I prefer local bookstores, but you're probably going to have a better shot getting it from there. And I've got 4 books: Winning Space, The Shadow War, Biohacked, and now the Ukraine book, How the West Lost Ukraine.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.